Good morning, everyone. This is Russell Rucker, and I'm here for another constitutional talk. I want to talk about America today. I want to talk about America. I want to talk about the founding and what's really important. America isn't just a place. It's not just a continent. It's not just New Spain and the United States and Russia and all the way down. America is also an ideal. It's an idea. We aren't Canadians, Mexicans, Bolivians. We're Americans. It's not United Statesians. And a lot of people want to point to America, especially people that want to tear down our country, as if we're all a bunch of slavers. Well, Jefferson owned slave, Madison owned slave. And Ben Franklin here didn't. Ben Franklin, John Dickinson, Alexander Hamilton didn't own slaves. We aren't all a group of slavers. And a lot of people want to point to the slave trade in America and somehow paint us all with a big brush and paint all of our founders with this evil brush. Now, I'm not disputing that slavery is a bad thing. I've seen the plantations where they've held them. I've seen Monticello. I've seen Ashland. I've seen these places where they were held, and I've seen the cottages, which would be about the best way to describe those slave quarters. They weren't much. But I do want to start today with a quote. A quote by John Locke. Now, John Locke was an Englishman, okay? And he states, slavery is so vile and miserable in the state of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation. Now, his nation is England. That 'tis hardly to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, should plead for it. Now, he's arguing for liberty. He's arguing against slavery. And the idea that this is all America's great sin is really an unfair accusation, because when we were part of English colonies, slavery was set up here. Every time our colonies tried to get rid of it, England would put a stop to it. England controlled the governors that controlled the individual colonies. They would appoint the governors, and this was one of the complaints during our original Declaration of Independence. In fact, the 20th complaint, if you were to number them, states, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating his most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opium of infidel, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He had prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain the external commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms amongst us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paving off crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. In every stage of these oppressions, we have a petition for redress in the most humblest terms. And it goes on. This is part of the original Declaration of Independence. It comes out of the Committee of Five in our Continental Congress. And the point here is we didn't create slavery. It was forced on us. But even so, virtually every community organization on earth had slavery or was involved in slavery at some time. In the Triangle Trades, when we picked up slaves, we didn't capture them. They were sold to us by black tribesmen in Africa. And they weren't all coming to the United States. They were scattered all over the North and South America and in other countries in the world. There were whites put into slavery. There were Orientals sold into slavery. Women were sold into slavery. Entire countries that were seized in over a 2,000-year period of time. The men were basically murdered and the women were sold into sexual slavery. So this isn't just unique to the United States, although there are people in our country that want to blame us for all of it and somehow run down all our founders as a bunch of slavers, which they weren't. Now, when we get into the Continental Congress, and a lot of people want to point to our Constitution, and they want to point to the 3/5 clause. But there are several things in the Constitution that really pertain to slavery, and I think we need to really get in and understand exactly what we're talking about here. So here we are, and we're talking about representation. This is our 3/5 clause. Service for a term of years, excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons, it says. That's what we're talking about with enumeration. Okay, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, which is your indentured servitude up north, and that's just as much slavery. The service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons, the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of Congress of the United States, and with every subsequent term of years. So, a lot of people say, well, you're claiming they're 3/5 of a man. They aren't a full man. Well, that's not true. What's true is we were counting them as 3/5. And the reason was for a purpose of taxation and representation. If we had counted them as whole people, then you would have had even more slave representation in the South, because you would have had more members of the House, which would have gone to the South. And I think that's an important thing to discuss when we're talking about slavery. And I'm no fan of slavery. I'm not here to excuse it. I'm not here to say, gee, it was a great idea. It was a great thing. But England wanted slavery here because they wanted products out of the United States. They established colonies to get products. They wanted the lumber. They wanted the cotton. They wanted the tobacco. They wanted the wheat. They wanted the goods they could get, the furs and everything. And slavery was cheap labor. It was easier for harvesting, especially down south, and that's why they did not want to remove slavery. And we were part of the British colonies. We weren't our own people. Not until 1783, after we fought the war and we were given that land. Okay, but let's go to section 9 here. Okay. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation. Now they're talking about the slave industry, the slave importation. So they're taxing it. When you tax something, you get less of it because people don't want to pay the tax. And so it doesn't really matter what it is. So this is actually a way of trying to limit it. The other thing in this section that's important to note is this is a 20-year moratorium. This is how they got through. This is the compromise. See, a lot of our northern representatives, those from Pennsylvania, you know, you're a Robert Morris and you're a Gouverneur Morris and all these, they did not own slaves. Some of the Northerners bought slaves just to free them. It was a way of emancipation. So when you look at this section, this moratorium for 20 years is what it is. It's a moratorium of 20 years to eliminate the slavery itself. And this is the purpose of this section. And again, we get to Article 5 of the Constitution. And they're talking about ratification and amendments. And it says the mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. Then it goes and says this: provided that no amendment which may be made prior to year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth classes in the 9 sections of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So there are 2 things they aren't allowing you to amend. And one of those is your slavery, your slave trade, basically because some of our representatives in the South were concerned about basically losing their way of life, their wealth. They were concerned about being able to harvest these crops and all those kind of things with slavery. Slavery is an absolute evil, and it flies in the face of liberty, of freedom, but at the same time, it's not exactly how it's painted today. Slaves were expensive. It cost money to buy a slave. You had to clothe them, you had to feed them, you had to house them. If they got sick or otherwise hurt, you had to take care of them. There's really no other way around it. They were expensive. And because they were expensive, most people did not own many. You had a few great plantations that had absolutely hundreds of them. For the most part, it wasn't the way it's painted today. And I think that's important to understand when we talk about this. It's not an excuse of it. It's just the truth does actually matter, and we should look at things in realistic value of what they actually are. Slavery is despicable by today's standards, but I do not wish to judge them on my morality, those that lived 200-300 years ago. And so I'm simply not going to do that. The people that were that owned slaves, many of those founders, like Jefferson, like Madison, Monroe, they gave great things too. And it doesn't the fact that they owned slaves does not minimize the great good they also did. And I really would hope that you take that from it. I have nothing against my fellow African American citizens here. They're citizens by virtue of the 13th through the 15th Amendments, the same as I am. We are all equal today. But it is important to note where we came from and what we were doing. The slaves that got to America were really, the slaves that got to the United States colonies were really the lucky ones. Many were sent, and we got a small percentage, actually. But many were sent to clear jungles in South America, and they didn't live as long. Many of them died because of the hardships of where they were sent and what they were doing. And that's something important to take in and understand as well. And up north with the indentured servitude, what made that worse was if you used up an indentured servant from up north, you had no reason to to hold them for anything. They were just used up and died. It was actually a worse situation than what the slaves had down south, except for indentured servitude was for a period of years. But most people didn't survive the indentured servitude because they were treated so poorly. I think you should think about this and understand the 3/5 section was not an adherence specific to slavery. It wasn't a love for slavery. It was the best they could get at the time. And when you looked at the Constitution and the Convention and the great amount of differing opinions in the meeting, this is how this survived. They couldn't get it through any other way. We lost a lot of men fighting for freedom and free the slaves. Or you can claim that it wasn't really about slavery, that it was about states' rights, that Lincoln was trying to unite the country and be president of all the slaves. But irregardless, Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, and more than 500,000 people died in the process of that war. Don't look at an original sin that people want to claim that it is an original sin. Don't look at that as a negative to disavow the entire Constitution and the entire constitutional process. Look at it as it's a step towards freedom, towards liberty, the same as many of the other steps were. Allowing women the right to vote, the later amendments allowing 18-year-olds to vote. All these different things were steps for advancements in the American experience. And I think that's the way we can look at it. Many of the things that even the people devoted to slavery did us a great service. Madison and his separation of powers, and all those kind of things that went into it. So it's best to realize that they did great good as well. And with that, I hope you can catch me next time on the next Constitutional Talk. Folks, have a good day for now. Please subscribe and follow me. I appreciate it. We'll catch you next week on the next Constitutional Talk. Goodbye for now.